Hello, hello! Welcome back to the Future Cities podcast. I am Jason Sauer, and you might remember my voice from the earliest 2 or 3 episodes of the podcast, where I introduced myself as a host alongside Vivian Gardusco and Stephen Elser. And for this month's episode, I have creative control, so I decided to focus on 2 issues facing many of us researchers in the network, but myself in particular. And those issues are of green gentrification, as well as the unintended effects of resilience research. So starting off, the term green gentrification can be defined mostly by its parts. So gentrification is the process by which residents in neighborhoods are replaced over time by wealthier individuals. So the term green gentrification can be defined basically by defining its parts. Gentrification itself is the process by which residents in a neighborhood are replaced over time by wealthier individuals. And green, in this case, just refers to a sort of broad set of green features in cities, like park spaces, trees, ponds, community gardens. And these can be either natural or man-made or managed by people. And depending on who you're talking to, some people might actually lump in other forms of more gray infrastructure that sort of serve environmental purposes. So like bike lanes might be a good example of that. But anyway, putting these terms together, green gentrification is more or less population overturn in areas of cities specifically, or at least in large part, due to the presence or installation of green features. And so believe it or not, as abstract as that definition might seem, green gentrification is a real thing, and it's something that you probably participate in. And so imagine that you need to or want to move to a new home. And imagine further that you make enough money that you can demand certain things from the place you'll move. So in addition to the features of the homes that you're looking at, you're probably also taking note of the sorts of green features in the neighborhood. So are there a lot of shade trees around? Are there nearby parks? Do people have cute front yard gardens? And so you would probably want to live in a place that has these sorts of green features rather than live in a place that's like all concrete and asphalt. Or so the people who own and sell these properties know that. They're probably trying to extract more money out of their current tenants and potential buyers like you because of those green features. And so let's think a bit more about the sort of dynamics of the people moving into and moving out of these homes. So do the current tenants own the property? Do you, the buyer, share the same socio-demographic traits like race or income as the previous tenants? And in cities, it's very probable that the answer to these questions is no. And in many cases in urban areas, because of green infrastructure initiatives, property values are going up, historical tenants are being coerced through various pricing mechanisms to move out, and new tenants with different demographics are replacing them. And so this is more or less how green gentrification works. And green gentrification is a problem for many of us in the research network because many of us are advocating for the installation or preservation or improvement of green infrastructure in urban areas. For example, I work in Valdivia, Chile, which is a gorgeous city in the southern part of the country. The city itself is built in a sort of temperate rainforest, similar to the Pacific Northwest, for those of you who know that region of the United States. So it's cool, it sits at low latitude, it gets a lot of rain, it's also close to the ocean, and it's at the meeting point of 3 rivers. So with all this water, Valdivia is the home to a network of natural urban wetlands. And I am currently in Valdivia studying how these wetlands might help protect the city from current floods as well as future floods as climate change alters the amounts and timing of rainstorms in the city. And so it's a fairly pure scientific endeavor. It's much more hydrology than anything else, but my findings could wind up being a driver of green gentrification. If, for example, I show that these wetlands will be increasingly valuable for dealing with stormwater in the years to come, given patterns of developments in the city as well as climate change, then it is possible that the homes around these wetlands may be valued more than those not built around wetlands. And so if my research is used to recommend the preservation or conservation of these wetlands, then it's likely that their other services like aesthetics or recreation will also be actively managed. And that can also raise the property values of the nearby homes. That's sort of similar to recommending the installation or the improvement of a nearby park. I'm not exactly comfortable with the thought of contributing to green gentrification, and it's increasingly unsettling to me how scientific work like mine can become sources of economic problems for people. It's not necessarily my job as a scientist to be concerned about these things. There's certainly no wrong or right scientifically to green gentrification. And there are no statements within the research network on where we fall with regard to green gentrification. But it does bother me as a person doing science that I'm potentially contributing to green gentrification. If people in Valdivia move, then let it be because of personal interests or some other factor, not because some blonde white dude from the United States came down and helped rentiers put a dollar value on the wetlands. So more generally, green gentrification is one of a host of problems that we resilience researchers may be contributing to if we don't consider these sorts of larger social, political, and economic systems in which we're doing our research. For this month's episode, I recorded a call with someone more rigorously engaged in these considerations than I am. Nathan McClintock, an associate professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State University, recently wrote an article describing the forces that cause urban gardening in Portland, Oregon, to be a source of green gentrification, and he joins me this week to talk. And for those of you curious, the article that he wrote is entitled, I'm quoting here, "Cultivating a Sustainability Capital, Urban Agriculture, Eco-Gentrification, and the Uneven Valorization of Social Reproduction." And in this episode, we are also joined by Marissa Matsler, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Carey Institute. However, before the recording began, we actually started having mic-level problems with Marissa. So instead of joining us as a voice on the podcast, she was able to contribute comments and questions via a chat window, which I note at various points in the interview. And so in this episode, we talk about green gentrification, racialized othering, and what Nathan thinks we can do about all of this. And so thanks again for joining us at the Future Cities podcast. I hope to make this one of a series of explorations into these social, political, and economic issues. And so if you enjoy it, make sure to subscribe and keep checking back at the first every month. I'll just ask you to introduce yourself since you probably know your more important credentials than I do.
Okay, sure. So my name is Nathan McClintock, and I'm an associate professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State University. I got my PhD in geography from UC Berkeley in 2011, and my dissertation research focused on urban agriculture in Oakland, California. But before that, I'd actually worked, I did my master's research as so my dissertation work was more in the sort of realm of human geography. But I also had a background through my master's in soil science and agroecology. And I did my master's at North Carolina State University. And I looked at nitrogen cycling in organic farming systems, looking at composting and cover crops, et cetera. And actually, during that time, I was able to spend some time in Senegal, working with the Rodale Institute, which is an organic research organization, organic farming research organization that at the time has some partnerships in Senegal. That work built on my interest and experience as a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa and Mali prior to my doing my master's degree. So it's sort of been a circuitous route from a humanities undergrad to going into the Peace Corps, really kind of delving into the science of sustainable agriculture before becoming interested in more the social questions surrounding agriculture. And I might be jumping ahead of myself in terms of the questions you want me to answer, but
yeah, no problem. I guess talk a bit more about the current work that you do at Portland State.
Sure. So yeah, my work, as I said before, I was doing my work in Oakland was on urban agriculture, and really I was looking at soil contamination, but also the sort of rise of the food justice movement, and it was environmental, sort of a interdisciplinary project that bridged environmental planning with participatory research, with kind of traditional urban geography, histories of disinvestment in the city, and trying to really make sense of why particular parts of Oakland were seeing a thriving urban agriculture scene. Where was the food justice movement coming from? And so when I got to Portland, I got there to start my job. I got there and was really surprised to see that there wasn't the same sort of thriving food justice movement that I'd seen in Oakland. Most of the urban agriculture that I encountered, 6 years ago when I moved to Portland, was really framed in terms of environmental sustainability, self-sufficiency, very eco orientation vis-a-vis in Oakland, where it was very much tied to food justice, racial justice, the history of the Black Panthers. So I was very surprised by just this stark difference in terms of what was motivating urban agriculture projects in Portland. I was expecting to see, urban ag gardens, et cetera, really flourishing in the more low-income areas of the city, but it was actually quite the opposite. It was urban agriculture thriving in the white, hip, gentrifying and gentrified neighborhoods. And so really my project since I've been at Portland State has been really kind of trying to unpack this and make sense of it, to really sort of tease apart what I refer to as urban agriculture's entanglement and these processes of gentrification. One of the things that came up in Oakland as I was leaving, when people were starting to say, urban agriculture, it's actually a lot of white hipsters are moving into the flatlands and doing urban agriculture. And there was talk, the concern over gentrification was really starting to bubble up.
Actually, sorry to interrupt you here. This might be a good time to, properly define what you're referring to as gentrification or green gentrification in particular.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. So gentrification in general, people have defined it as the sort of progressive, the change in a neighborhood to cater to more affluent populations. But you can't speak about gentrification without talking about a process of displacement that goes along with it. So we shouldn't just say gentrification in terms of like rising home values or revitalization or the revitalization of a neighborhood. It comes with the displacement of the inhabitants who were there prior to this valuation. So I'd say green gentrification is really gentrification and displacement occurring within the same within a broader context of urban greening and environmental sustainability. So with the addition of green infrastructure and green amenities playing a central role in this revitalization, their presence contributing to the rise in property values as well as to sort of the changing nature of the neighborhood. Their green amenities and green infrastructure attracting new residents, being marketed to new residents. And then really sort of tied into the general displacement, the general gentrification process as we know it. So it's actually difficult in today's day and age with urban greening playing such a central role in, cities in urbanization processes. I mean, I would say a lot of, it's not really, green gentrification is not different than regular gentrification, except for the fact that urban greening processes, urban infrastructure plays a perhaps more visible and central role.
Yeah. And so you deal primarily in this article with sort of gardening beds, or I forgot the term that you actually used in the article, but these urban garden spaces. But what are some other examples that you have of green gentrification? I deal with this here in Valdivia with regard to the wetlands in the city, which are these more natural features. They're not constructed, although they are managed. There's concerns about green gentrification that tie into the sort of valorization or, valuing of the ecosystem services that they play. So that's how I kind of come into it. But just for the sake of a broader definition or like a better idea of what are some other things, particularly in Portland or elsewhere, that cause green gentrification?
Yeah, some other sort of types of infrastructure perhaps would be, so in Portland we have these bioswales, that are similar to, many constructed wetlands for drainage. You could consider even green space, the implementation of little mini parks or pocket parks. You could consider bike lanes, anything that's sort of being couched and promoted for purposes of environmental sustainability and greening the city, I would say could fall under these auspices. There's work that's done on farm to table restaurants and farm to table grocery stores, like imagine your Whole Foods, et cetera, and those sort of being wrapped into these processes of green gentrification as well, because these are things that people associate. They're green amenities, are things that people associate with living a more green lifestyle. So it's a pretty broad stretch, and again, it's difficult to sort of tease the green out of the general processes of gentrification and the amenities that are attracting more affluent populations.
Right. And so what actually got you interested in urban agriculture in the first place? You said you had worked on this again in Oakland as well as Portland, but what was the drive for it?
I had a background in kind of global South sustainable agricultural development, both in the Peace Corps and then in my master's work and afterwards working as a consultant in several countries. But I was always sort of struck by the presence of agriculture in bustling cities in the global South, people herding goats and cows up and down the streets, through taxi cabs and people growing food anywhere they could, on the side of the road and in little, strips of the median, et cetera. And so when I moved to Oakland to start my PhD, I was actually initially planning to do my work back in West Africa. But, there was such a sort of vibrant urban agriculture movement happening so close to home, really just out my front door, that's how I got involved in it here, I would say sort of domestically, and it really shifted my focus domestically. Like I said, I think when I was involved in urban agriculture in Oakland, I was very much sort of part of the bright-eyed, bushy-tailed group of people thinking of urban agriculture as this sort of revolutionary way to combat food injustice and a way to rally the troops, so to speak, about racial injustice and the realities of the Oakland flatlands. But I think the more time I spent with it, the less bright-eyed, bushy-tail I became. And I just really started seeing that the critiques that were coming from different activists in Oakland were really starting to, I was sort of blind to them at the beginning, and then they started to sink in. And then when I got here to Portland, they just seemed so strikingly true that so much of the activity around urban agriculture was sort of kind of white environmentally focused participants, and these not really being spaces that people of color felt particularly welcome in. And so even if people of color have long participated in food production, the way that food production was going on in a city like Portland just sort of contributed to this sense of, green Portland, sustainable Portland. Portlandia is really just it's sort of a gentrifying space. It's a white space, and there's not really a place for people of color in those spaces. I've never sort of made the claim that urban agriculture causes gentrification, but it's become clearer and clearer to me that it has become coded or seen or viewed as part of this larger process of gentrification. It's been coded as a sort of white space that people don't necessarily feel comfortable entering into if they don't fit that same demographic.
Sure. And this isn't in the list of questions that I had sent you, but it came up when you were talking about Oakland and Portland, and also the history with the Black Panther movement. And that reminded me of Move in Philadelphia and the sort of legacy that urban agriculture had, just in terms of making these largely Black communities resilient, or not resilient, it's the wrong term, but less dependent on these sorts of forces that they felt were working against them. And it's interesting how that legacy, is still continuing today, but urban agriculture, it's, I definitely think about it in terms of the sort of now I know a lot of people who own chicken coops.
Right. So that really sort of getting at the heart of what my research is on. It's, that type of urban agriculture for what I would call self-determination, community self-determination that you're, referring to in Philly, that you see in parts of Detroit, that you certainly saw in the Oakland Flatlands back in the day, that you continue to see you see it in Portland as well. That has always existed, and that's always been a very important place. And places like D-Town Farms in Detroit, it's really about community, black self-determination. And at the same time, that's also the urban agriculture that doesn't get the attention in the media, right? The urban agriculture that people are practicing in Black neighborhoods in Brooklyn or in Philly, and that perhaps have been gardens that have been there for 50, 75 years, don't receive the same attention that a rooftop garden, cultivated by some 25-year-old white hipsters, with a savvy social media presence. They're the ones who are getting the media coverage, and with that media coverage also comes material support. It comes, in the form of grants, in the form of deals for subsidized land. Getting the roof of a building for next to nothing. And so what you actually see is a real shift, a disproportionate support of a particular type of urban agriculture practiced by a particular group of people. So what, and in so doing, the reinforcing of socioeconomic disparities. And so really that's what drives my work right now is kind of delving into that. And the paper that you're referring to in the Annals of the AAG is really kind of getting at this question of where value comes from, right? It's very sort of theoretical paper, but why is it that a garden by a hipster in a gentrifying neighborhood adds value, is valorized, creates economic value in a way that
right. And
why is the exact same practice, this practice of growing food, disproportionately valorized when it's done by gentrifiers, as opposed to people of color, older people with a long tradition of gardening? And as I just said, key to the concern for me is just that in focusing on the sort of hip, highly visible kind of performative agriculture, on the rooftop or, sort of on the top of a restaurant or next to a restaurant or, this type of agriculture, focusing on that does contribute to, it does just become another green amenity that is marketed in the development process.
Yes. And this kind of gets into another question I didn't have here, and maybe it's difficult to go through the sorts of mechanisms, but could you explain how you see the sorts of uneven valorization feeding into this sort of green gentrification system? You talk about in your paper about cultural capital being converted into economic capital and things like that. Which you can definitely talk about if you want to go that direction, or just feel
I think
free
I'll
to
be a lot less articulate speaking about it instead of spending months writing the article. I think, like I said, there's this uneven valorization that occurs because in Portland, in the sort of highly gentrifying area, you have to have people who recognize the value in something, in a green amenity, right? So you have to have like a large enough concentration of people to recognize the kind of symbolic value of urban agriculture as this sustainable technology, as this green infrastructure, as this kind of as this beneficial thing. And the city, takes pride on its green orientation, and so things like urban gardens and rain gardens and things like that, they are valued, right? They're part of the image that the city would like to convey. And in this day and age, cities are very entrepreneurial. They depend on branding themselves in order to get investment and in order to get people to move there, in order to get companies to settle there. And so they're really trying to sell the lifestyle and sell themselves as being livable places. And so you have to have enough people around who recognize that, in a particular neighborhood, who look at a garden and see, ooh, that person is living sustainably. They're growing their own food. They're diverting their rainwater into a rain garden instead of into the gutter or into the sewage system. So you have to have both the agglomeration of people who recognize the activity, as well as, an agglomeration of the activity itself. And so in some parts of town, you actually do have agglomerations of the activity. You have people growing food, but perhaps they're doing it in their backyard. Why? Because historically, food production was something you did in your backyard, and your front yard was something that you kept neat and tidy and clean to present yourself not as a poor backwoods hillbilly or, a sharecropper, but somebody who had made it, somebody who had, achieved the American dream of a house and a lawn. And so putting your garden out front would actually be very contrary to how you viewed what's necessary to sort of build that kind of cultural capital, to sort of demonstrate and perform how you've succeeded in life. So what you see is that there's different concentrations of people viewing the same activity in different ways. In a city like Portland, at this kind of municipal level, you have the city itself supporting these green activities and these green amenities and green behaviors in a particular way, it dives right into the sort of branding, and it dives right into the value that's produced for the city, right? So you have people who are doing urban agriculture in places that are highly visible in the gentrifying areas, the areas that are viewed as highly livable. That all sort of fits into the narrative of the city. That all makes its way into the videos, into the Portlandia episodes, into the reports, the cover illustrations of the reports is showing like, hey, look, this is how great Portland is and how green of a city it is, which ultimately produces capital, right? But the same activity that's going on in a low-income neighborhood in East Portland, sort of in someone's backyard, isn't playing that role. It's not producing economic value in any way possible, but it's still the same sort of social reproduction that's taking place. And when I say social reproduction, I just mean sort of a term from Marxian political economy. It's all the labor that goes into producing labor. So everything that happens at home, the work that's necessary to keep laborers alive, essentially.
The way that I kind of understand this, as you've written, but also in general, urban agriculturists do not cash out on their own cultural capital, but it's rentiers, boosters, and financiers exchange these free gifts of culture for economic capital, at a completely different scale. I mean, that's probably the more compelling aspect about this to me, and like why it's such a big problem, because it's not as though, green gentrification is basically you have priced yourself out of the neighborhood. Like you've made it nice enough, or other people have made your neighborhood appear nice enough, or, promote such and such outward values that outside interests can use to produce their own sort of economic capital. And so it's an issue of like lopsided, or gosh, I'm trying to think of the proper terms here. So it's distribution of the capital outside of the people who are actually producing it.
You also have where it's produced and who it's produced by, then fueling the gentrification process as well, right? And so it's not as if one part of town just has poor people, and the other originally that one part of town just had poor people and the other part had rich people, but there's a process that moved people from one part of town to the other, right? And so my interest in how urban agriculture is part of this process is sort of thinking about what are the amenities that are both attracting people to a particular neighborhood, how and why are these amenities being valued in such a way that they then attract more people to that neighborhood and attract more investment into that neighborhood, which then drives out those remaining original inhabitants, right? So it's sort of how are these activities, sort of fodder for the fire of gentrification, and at the same time, it's not obviously the activity itself, because that activity is practiced by everybody, but it's more valuable when it's practiced by somebody who will attract investment.
How relatively few urban agriculturists are actually reaping
there's
any
a
amount
who,
of the
who
financial capital that's being generated.
Market gardens where they're selling their produce, or maybe they're selling their skills. They give workshops and things like that. But for the most part, people are just growing food for themselves, for their own lifestyle, for their own for social reproduction, to feed their families, and to as recreation, to provide a sense of fulfillment and mental health. But no, they're not reaping the rewards. And, perhaps they're going to price themselves out of the neighborhood, or maybe they're quote unquote the pioneers, the gentrifiers who've just recently arrived in a neighborhood. And then, many more people just like them will be arriving not long after.
Yes. And so I work with this kind of in the context of an ecosystem services sort of impact, where there are these wetlands in Valdivia, and I'm in the process basically of trying to assign or figure out what is the value of these wetlands in terms of like their flood mitigation. And so the problem sort of inherent in that is I'm trying to prove that they are valuable, but once you figure out the market worth of something like this, then it's subject to all the regular forces of capitalism. So say a neighborhood with a wetland that's actually providing some flood protection now, it might provide even more flood protection in the future due to climate change. Basically, the issue that I have is I don't know how to assign a value to this sort of thing without potentially causing problems for the citizens that live into this place. And so I know you are kind of more involved in the urban planning side of things. So I was wondering, how do you sort of reconcile this position as a critical social theorist with the sort of work, with this sort of analysis that you do? Like, how do you bridge the gap here?
I mean, it's a great question. Well, first of all, I wouldn't claim to be a planner by any stretch. I do teach in an urban studies and planning department and do my research there. And I would say I certainly read and engage with plenty of scholarship on planning and scholarship of planning. But as a practitioner, I would say my kind of, I do teach a food systems class, a food systems planning class. But I would say, and it's more in the realm of community development that I would sort of hang my planning hat if I had to. And so, I teach in our undergraduate community development program, and so that's, I would say, the approach that I take in my kind of planning activities is thinking about how to do community development in a way that is participatory, that really does engage community, that doesn't place the cart before the horse and go in and say, hey, we need a garden. Let's see if we can get people to, show up to a meeting, and then sort of like gives their pros and cons about the garden if they want it or not, but then do it anyway, right? Whereas participation is just sort of a checklist, is just a box off on a checklist, but really kind of putting the needs of the community first and saying, hey, all right, what's going on? Here's a palette of different, interventions, and maybe they're not even urban design related. Maybe they're actually what in other countries they refer to as social planning, right? In terms of they might be, economic development programs or job readiness programs, or maybe just jobs themselves, right? And so it's that question of what does a community need, and really placing that as central. I think that's one piece of the puzzle in terms of how I reconcile this issue. Communities might feel that, no, we actually don't want gardens right now, because those are we don't want gardens unless we have some sort of other kind of guarantee of to protect housing prices, or to keep people in the neighborhood. We don't want these green infrastructures unless we are sure that we're going to be safe and be able to stay in our neighborhood. So I think taking consideration of all that's really important. Another piece is for me that I've really been working on too is it's sort of the flip side of the concern over the kind of gentrifiers. It's focusing on those people who do practice urban agriculture, but who don't receive the credit for it, who are overlooked, for whom their urban agriculture is not producing value for the city. And to me, part of that is there's sort of a kind of truth and reconciliation to it. It has to do with, giving credit where credit's due. Right now I have a project working with an African-American organization that focuses on foodways. Their focus is on sort of rekindling African-American connections to food and agriculture. And they run a farm at the Oregon Food Bank, and they're really trying to engage more. They're African American themselves, and they're trying to engage more people of color in food production. And so they approached me and said, "Hey, we really want to study the history of Black gardens in Portland." And so we've been doing an oral history project and archival project to really kind of tease this apart. And one of the fascinating things that we found was that it was really in Albina, the which was once the sort of the Black neighborhood of Portland, historically Black neighborhood of Portland, that's really the sort of ground zero of gentrification. That had a community gardening program that preceded the city's community gardening program, and really in some ways served as a model for the city's community gardening program. But it's not something that it's all part of the narrative or the history of the city's sustainability, history of sustainability. So for me, it's also giving credits where it's due, so that those people actually get those same resources, to divert resources, to emphasize and prioritize resourcing those people who've actually been part of it from the beginning. And so that's another sort of angle on the kind of implementation side that I would emphasize.
I guess that gets at part of it. I'm trying to think of like larger lessons for this sort of valuation of services of this green infrastructure. So, I mean, you mentioned
Well,
two there.
I'm not somebody who is a proponent of placing numeric values on these things. So that's just I've come to that conclusion over my engagement over the several years that I've been engaged in these types of projects. And, several of the people who, you work with the UREx project, I've worked with them in the past on, at Portland State, we had a ecosystem services IGRIP program. And, I think that especially for those coming from the social sciences, that very question of valuation was always the crux. And I think the questions you're raising are always the crux. What does it mean to actually place these numbers on something, to add, essentially we're adding an exchange value to something that previously only had a use value. And so what are the sort of political ramifications of doing something like that? And on one hand, you understand sort of from an ecological economics or even an environmental economics perspective that it's all part and parcel and necessary to account for the externalities. And I get that. But what are we also doing politically? What floodgates are we opening politically and economically for not just gentrification, but just commoditization in general, right? And for the commodification of nature, and what are the implications of doing that, as opposed to setting aside things and places outside of the market that aren't quantified, because in doing so, you are not reducing or abstracting the value of something down to a number or an index, but you're actually, saying this place is value. Here are all of its multiple uses. Sort of a qualitative assessment, a qualitative indexing, where look at all of the different ways that this place is used, all of the different spiritual values that it has, the cultural values that it has, the material values that are related to social reproduction or that are related to everyday subsistence that it has. You don't need to quantify those to catalog them, right? And so for me, that's more the approach that I take, simply because everything there is a tendency to quantify and therefore commodify everything. And if you can if someone can make a buck off of something, they're going to do that. And by the first step in doing that is putting a price on it, right?
Marissa points out here, or she was wondering if you could go further into the ideas of cataloging versus quantifying. So yeah, if you want to speak more about that.
Just from a sort of research perspective, methodological perspective, I would say it is kind of the difference between doing qualitative and quantitative research. You're not cataloging in the sense of here, I'm going to come up with a descriptive statistic to count the number of uses, but we're going to actually delve into those uses. We're going to find how people, whatever the wetlands you're looking at or the gardens that I'm looking at, what are people's experiences with those? What are they used for? What are people's relationship to place? What value does it place? What's the value of that place socially and culturally, historically, and in the present and in the future? What are people's visions for it? What is it? What type of sense of place does it provide? So these are all very abstract concepts, but they're all ones that I think we can all relate to. They're things that we feel in ourselves. There is no. I think. Part of it is just sort of the prioritization and the value of quantitative science over qualitative science, the value of biophysical science over social science. But particularly people who are involved in interdisciplinary work, environmental work, there's such a rich opportunity for interdisciplinary collaborations that really place qualitative data equally alongside the quantitative data. And I think this is an example where you can qualitatively catalog use values of a place in a way that demonstrate its how important it is, that demonstrate its value, rather than assigning an index to that.
And it's difficult because there's such a pressure to actually value these spaces, perhaps especially in urban locations where everything seems to have price tags attached to it. There's your experiences in the city are much more metered in terms of the economic value of all of them because you're constantly being charged for them. So it's one of those experiences it's a conflict for me because I feel like if we don't engage with this feature or if like we need to find mechanisms or think about ways to resist this sort of quantifying that can result from cataloging in these spaces. And so Marissa points out here, or raised the question of, what policy and planning mechanisms do you see as engaging these more qualitative sides of things that you're talking about?
Of the specific mechanisms, I don't feel qualified to comment on, but I could speak more broadly to say that, for example, an example that sort of speaks to what we are discussing would be parks, right? A city park. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in terms of if you pencil it out vis-a-vis the land values, or a garden too, for that matter, right? But gardens aren't necessarily, they don't have the same status and they don't have that same sort of permanence as a city park does. A city park that's some very, very valuable real estate, but it certainly would be more valuable in terms of the exchange value as condos that are, sold for $750,000 each, et cetera. But nevertheless, we ascribe a particular value. I mean, you could then run a hedonic analysis and say, well, look at how much it increases the value of the properties surrounding it to have a park. But I still don't know that pencils out, right? And so there is a normative case and a normative approach that we think
Right.
that there is some intrinsic value to, green space, open space, fresh air, clean water, a view, right? And so these are the things that, again, you can incorporate into a hedonic analysis and see what the impact of those things are on prices, on exchange values. But is that what's actually driving the implementation of those things? I don't think so. I don't think that's why we build a park, is so that we can increase the property values around it. And so it's sort of tapping into that question of like, well, why are we building the park in the first place? What do we hope we get out of it? And again, it doesn't, I don't think, boil down to us analyzing the cost benefit ratio of what's the increased benefit to public health. If people, X number of people go into the park and spend X number of hours there per day, how does that increase their heart rate to a particular, we can do that. And there's plenty of people who make their living doing that. But is that really where we need to direct our attention, rather than having a sort of normal, taking a normative stance and saying this is a societal benefit? Of course, those normative stances are precisely the battleground, the terrain of politics, right? People do different things. Let's look at what happened to the national monuments yesterday, right?
Yes, I was about to bring this up. With the sort of administration changes and changes in politics, it is we're constantly like on our back foot, trying to figure out like, well, how do I counter this argument? Because it wasn't like we didn't generate this space in the first place because of the dollar amount value, but that is suddenly the argument that we are having to combat, because someone can do the analysis, although to be honest, the analysis of like oil and gas exploration in these places is not anywhere near as precise as it tends to be promoted as. But anyway, you get the idea. We have to sort of counter these sorts of arguments in some cases, like with Bears Ear or the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and say like, well, there's this dollar amount here. What is this doing for us?
I guess the question is if like you don't boil it all down to one or the other, right? You don't just make it an economic analysis question. Because a lot of times it's not going to pan out. The economic analysis won't give us what we want, and then we're going to be living in a wasteland, one day. And I was just reading about this yesterday in terms of this term solastalgia, which is this sentiment of kind of nostalgia, but in a place not being away, not homesickness away from being home, but you're at home and it's different than how it used to be. And it's sort of like looking around you at the wasteland that your home has become. And I think, we risk, by just solely having an economic analysis, we risk losing all of those things that we actually hold, that we value, but that we can't actually place a numeric value on, right? I think that's something that we have to remember. And so tapping into those stories and the sort of qualitative analyses of those values, placing those sort of front and center, and placing the stories of people and their experiences side by side. And, and I say this as someone who spent plenty of time running statistics and I still do, I run stats on GIS and on survey data, but it's, in the end, I'm very careful. And actually I sort of see that as just sort of little bits of side data to the centrality of the qualitative data that I'm presenting first and foremost.
I get that. All right. On this note, we have like 3 minutes left of our allotted time. I could either ask like one question about, ways you see going forward, this with your own research or, against these sort of things, or we can wrap.
I guess I would just say, well, I mentioned, the current research on sort of green gentrification in urban agriculture I've been working on a comparative study, NSF-funded comparative study in Portland and in Vancouver, and then I'm on another project that's funded by the National Health Institute of Quebec, looking at the same sort of taking the same methodology and looking at in Montreal as well. So that's all sort of happening and wrapping up, and we're going to turn the Portland Vancouver stuff into a book in the next year or two. And then the other thing, though, that I did mention, that the Urban Gardens project, and that's really kind of taken me on a more kind of historical track, and I'm actually really interested in following this, historically, because just to kind of get at this question of illustrating this question of how we valued things differently in different times and places. I think having a historical perspective is really important. And so what I'm looking at now is kind of thinking about these processes of displacement in Portland as they relate to land, and then sort of using gardens and food production as the window into looking into these larger processes of how race and capital and urbanization all go hand in hand. That's sort of my next project, is to really kind of go back in time to really the beginnings of the city, and to sort of think about how these processes were all tangled up. So there's definitely a lot more archival research in my horizon, because I think ultimately, particularly now in today's day and age, and all of the how race has flared up to the forefront, and how the ugly side of our country's past is still very much festering. I think this type of historical research will actually be pretty valuable to understanding the present. So that's what I'm focused on right now, or will be focusing on more and more.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us about this.
Thanks for hosting me and having me.
Definitely a lot to think about with my own research, certainly. Yeah, thanks so much.